Are you tired of your valuable ideas and suggestions getting lost in the shuffle? Well, that is why I'm introducing Direct Suggest, the revolutionary digital suggestion box that puts your voice front and center. With Direct Suggest, you have the power to make a difference in your organization. Direct Suggest provides value to organizations in various industries worldwide, including notable brands like Comcast, TD Bank, and Nokia. And here's the best part. Direct Suggest only costs 50 cents per employee per month, making it an affordable solution for businesses of all sizes. Plus, they have an incredibly high ROI and savings potential with an average 33 times return on investment. The implementation process is also a breeze. Once committed, setting up Direct Suggest from start to finish can be completed in as quickly as a week or less. Don't let your ideas or your team's ideas go unnoticed. Visit directsuggest.com today and start by making a difference with Direct Suggest. Use the promo code HUMANHR for your extended 60-day free trial. Again, visit directsuggest.com to learn more, and remember to use promo code HUMANHR for an extended free trial. Direct Suggest, where your voice matters. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode. And if you're listening on YouTube, or watching on YouTube, I should say, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. This week, I have a wonderful guest with me joining the podcast. His name is Joshua Berry, and he is a world-class facilitator of change. As an author, speaker, entrepreneur, and director of Econic, Joshua has spent the last 2 decades evolving the what, who, and why of Fortune 500 companies and venture-backed startups. Along with his team, Joshua has sparked change in organizations like US Bank, John Deere, Procter & Gamble, Nelnet, Emeritus, Omaha Public Power District, Farm Credit Services of America, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Nebraska, among others. For employees and leaders looking to grow themselves and their organizations, Joshua speaks on overcoming limiting beliefs, adaptive leadership, and the innovation systems and mindsets that create engines for growth. And there are a bunch of ways that you can learn more about Joshua, and that is on his website as well as econic.co. And we'll have all of those linked in the show notes as well. But in the meantime, Joshua, thank you so much for joining the podcast. This is a very special topic and one that I'm really excited to delve into.
Oh, I mean, we are all about bringing the humans back into the workplace and into HR. I can't wait to get into this with you, Traci.
I love that. I'm so glad to hear that. And actually, when I think about our initial discussion when we were talking about bringing you on the podcast, what really kind of struck me was this idea of not only how language can impact beliefs and perspectives and the way that we kind of interact with employees, but it's really around this concept of intentional language use and how that impacts culture and decisions and beliefs. So can you kind of first, I guess, walk the listeners through why this topic is so special to you and why you are passionate about it enough to come on my podcast to talk about it?
Absolutely. Well, I'm imagining people listening to your podcast already recognize that the world of work is evolving and continuing to shift. People are trying to adapt new practices of how we work, why we work, where we're working, etc. And one of the places where I'm advocating that we need to have further evolution is the words that we use to describe people and the systems and the other things that we have within the work. I think case in point, one of them is the evolution of what we call you and I, who are practitioners in the space, right? Like personnel to human resources, to human capital, to people systems, just the evolution of what do we mean when we're talking about people. And, the majority of our clients that we still work with have human resources departments. And some of what we challenge people to think about is, what do you gain and what do you lose when you think about people as resources? And a bunch of other ways that language, oftentimes subconsciously or without much intention, actually influences how we approach the practices of people at work.
That's really interesting. It begs the question of how you view people in a workforce? Like, is there a better term other than resources?
Yeah, I don't know if I have the 100% this is what it is. And in fact, that's a lot of what I'm advocating for people is not jump from one thought leader to the next thought leader
Mm-hmm.
of what the next best thing is to call it. It's the people lead more of the thoughts themselves and they don't just copy and paste whatever they had before.
Right.
Because again, there's good and there's bad by saying people are resources. And I
Right.
don't think
Right.
most people are going at it saying, yep, I use the word resources so that I can objectify the people in my system, right? I don't think they're meaning
Mm-hmm.
that. And yet,
Mm-hmm.
some of the unintended consequences of that is exactly that. To answer directly your question, though, I like people, I like the people term, right? I like people systems, I like people
Mm-hmm.
operations, I like the things that
Mm-hmm.
refer to people as people. And maybe to
Mm-hmm.
give another concrete example around it, I've led sales and marketing teams a number of times in my life. And that is an area that is just full of words that refer to people as not people, right? If we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about
Yeah,
someone as a
sure.
lead, or we're trying to put people into a funnel, or we're trying to target or prospect, right? Like Tracy, being a
Yeah.
prospect, that's the word we'd use for when we'd find like a mine or something that had precious metals in it that we'd take metal pickaxes to, right?
Right.
Like yes, that in some ways that is what people are talking about when they're thinking of sales, but that is a very dehumanizing approach to thinking about trying to serve the wants or needs of someone else, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. And it made me start to think, well, is there a world in which people view the term human resources as the resource being the practitioner and the human being the person? But then it's like, well, if that's the case, human isn't really the right term, because when human in some ways is also a little bit dehumanizing, because it's like, well, who are we talking about here, right? It's like, well, then is it employee resources? Is it people resources? Like, if people are thinking that way, that
Yeah,
they see human resources as the resource to the human,
yeah.
then could it be people resources? But then that's where ultimately people operations, people
Hmm.
strategy, people engagement, whatever it is, that kind of plays that type of role also. And then, when I think about like the history of HR, you already mentioned it, personnel. I remember recently reading on LinkedIn, someone was like, it's like, we need to stop seeing ourselves as HR people. We are individuals who work in the HR department. And it made me think, well, is there a difference between a person who works in HR and an HR person? Like, or is it that we call ourselves HR people or HR practitioners because our practice is so deeply connected, not only to who we are, but to the population that we serve?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to break down. I mean, we could go on and on, and I feel more confused now than I was before.
Well, but I think you're doing what I hope that any of us as leaders do, and that's continue to wake up to what we think and believe to be true about people or the other things around us, and be more active in terms of how those influence the practices and things that we bring to the world, right? If
Right.
we think of, let's go back to the first way you used it, if we think of people as resources, as another thing on the income statement, that is another line item that we need to look at, the good and the bad that comes from that, right? You can absolutely start to see it's easier to justify cuts
Mm-hmm.
that you make, or
Mm-hmm.
or other things that are doing, because you're able to distance yourself a little bit away from the two eyes that I see across this virtual
Right.
meeting with me, right? Um, and yet, like, some of those things then lead to policies or procedures that say, like, well, we need to put stuff in place to help make this a more well-oiled machine. Another
Mm-hmm.
term that maybe doesn't
There's
have a
another
lot of
one,
thought
right?
behind it. And so we just need to be a little bit more intentional, I think, about what those words are, and then how do they influence the practices that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think we could go on and on and on about what the right term or the
Yeah.
better term or the appropriate term. And also, I think sometimes it varies by industry. Like, certain industries are inherently more focused, or maybe I should say less focused on people, more focused on line items, whether
Yeah.
right or wrong. Maybe it's just the nature of their business. And at least being a guest on my podcast, that humanity in HR, humanity in business or practice is really important to me. And I do think that in many cases, there are examples of people and or businesses not necessarily humanizing their operations or the way
Yeah.
that they do things. And thinking about the intentionality, which is something that you just mentioned, one of the very practical examples to me is in the ignoring or actively, or maybe it's more passively responding or actively ignoring things that might come up in the workplace. So
Yeah.
for example, something like a harassing message or something that's inappropriate, if a manager or a person in that setting doesn't report it or doesn't say, hey, that's not appropriate,
Yeah.
what message does that send to others in the room who are not part of that one-to-one discussion potentially?
Yeah. Anything that starts to not see people as whole people, as you said, and
Mm-hmm.
tries to compartmentalize it, does de-risk the dehumanizing.
Right.
And maybe just to bring this down to even more concrete examples for people, um, some of how we view other people then and what we believe to be true about other people then reflects in these practices or things that we might create in terms of how work should be done. There is an example that I used in my book about a manufacturing company called Favi. And a new CEO took over this firm. His name was Jean-Francois. And when he took it over, one of the first things that he noticed was a worker named Alfred, who was standing at the storeroom trying to get a new pair of gloves. And Jean-Francois noticed that it ended up taking this gentleman 10, 15 minutes to get new gloves because he was standing there with his old gloves and a coupon from his boss and waiting for the storeroom clerk to bring his new gloves. And when they did the math, found out that the gloves only cost them about $1, but his time off of the manufacturing line cost almost $20. It was so it was very much one of these things where traditional management approach would say, "Oh, there's inefficiencies there. Maybe we need a process improvement plan or project to be able to make this a little bit better for us." But Jean-Francois took it a step further. He said, "What would have had to been in the minds of the people who designed this process? What did they believe about someone like Alfred that they need to have this policy in place?" And he assumed, and it was rightly so when talking to the others, like, we lock up these tools so people don't steal them. And he said, okay, um, what if we unlocked these tools? And they said, well, maybe people would steal them. How often do we think people will steal these gloves? Right? He's like, maybe every once. I don't know. And he said, even if somebody stole a pair of gloves every once in a while to take home for gardening or whatnot, we'd probably be better off ahead. And but he pressed it even further. He said, this and so many of our other processes and policies and procedures at that facility were built around the assumption that mankind was bad and that we needed to create things to protect ourselves from this selfish, lazy person who's trying to take advantage of the corporation as much as possible. And so in his memoir, he delivers this great, memorable line, which is, people tend to act as they are considered. And what he did is they unlocked the tools and they saw, of course, people didn't really steal the gloves. And that led them to a bunch of other things. Like they stopped penalizing people for showing up 15 minutes late. And lo and behold, people actually started to show up early and they stayed a little bit later. They broke down the management cantina where people sat differently from the day laborers, and just one thing after another, they started to show people, like, we think you're good, we think you matter, we want not just your hands, we want your brains and your hearts into this work as well. And now the work practices will reflect that. And not only did it create a better work environment, but also the results came. Right. They ended up getting to be the leader in their particular market for these automotive parts that they made. Costs went down, quality went up, like all these other things continued to improve from a pure business standpoint, because they said, we're actually going to take a step back and we're going to see the human within every person and believe that to be true about them.
That's fascinating. It really makes me think about how, and kind of reiterating what he shared at the end of his memoir, that what we assume about people is what they inevitably kind of become, whether they intend to or not. It is ultimately what they become in our minds too, in our
Yeah.
beliefs. Because I mean, we see this a lot in HR, and a lot of it contributes to the stigmas that there are around this practice. That HR is kind of like this, often the term police, right,
Hmm.
around different things. And I don't think anyone really gets that much joy out of policing things, from an HR perspective, at least, right?
Sure. Sure.
And so it's like, how do we break down that stigma? And part of it is in changing the way that we institute policies or practice our own ethos, our own, what our own professions. And so what comes to mind for me is, when we create policies within this practice, are they designed to, or are they designed based on the assumption that people are going to do the right thing always, or are they designed based on the assumption that people are to be held accountable because they're not going to do the right thing? And it depends, and it varies, right, based on the practitioner.
Yeah. What 100%. I mean, it's funny you mentioned accountability. I had this with another HR team. We were discussing, they said we need more system to hold people accountable. We said, great. What is our starting point? Do we assume people will deliver? And there is that our starting point? Or do we assume people
Mhm.
will not deliver, and therefore we need systems to be able to keep them within the right controls and the ranges that we need? Either one of them come to a different means of how we're going to implement whatever it is that you're trying to do. If I believe in the first one, you're like, I believe people are trying their best, I'm going to help them see that they're trying their best. Well, then I'm probably starting out with, if Traci's saying she's going to do it, I believe her. And my position
Mhm.
is more about, hey, Traci, what do you need to help you get this done? Now it's about support, and it's about coming alongside you in what you're doing versus assuming every time there's a miss, like well, Traci's trying to get away with stuff. Oh, Traci's trying to do these things. I need to have more systems of accountability. And unfortunately, it creates vicious cycles, because then the
Mhm.
person says, oh, Traci doesn't trust me, or the boss doesn't trust me, and therefore, or maybe I need to do less. And we get into some of these vicious cycles. And so what was so beautiful about the Favi situation is it was more of a virtuous cycle, in that trust beget trust, right? And so those things started to feed off of
Right.
each other. But it takes somebody to lean in and start.
Definitely.
Somebody has to start.
Definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah. Let it, whoever's listening to this, let it be you. When I think about this idea of assuming positive intent, I think I shared this with you when we first spoke a few months ago, that my boss is a huge proponent and believer in this idea of the API method, assuming positive intent. And when I
Hmm.
think about intention, it's a word that comes up a lot these days. It's like, I didn't intend to hurt you. I didn't intend to do this. I didn't intend to do that. Or my intention was to do X, Y, and Z. And so when we think about, at least, practically in the role of an HR practitioner, intent is a two-way street. What do you intend a policy or your actions is meant to do? Or
Hmm.
what do you intend to do with X, Y, or Z? And what does that person, or what did that person intend when they acted in whatever way? And I think it's also helpful or important to think about the intention that hasn't been realized yet. Like when we're creating policies and we say, oh, well, uh, employees can't smoke, right, in remote meetings. Like, let's say this is something that comes up a lot. Like, what is a remote, an appropriate behavior for remote employees? Is it
Yeah.
based on, someone who's working in an office, or is it based on a totally new set of principles? And a lot of that is assuming what the intention is for someone that has not even had the opportunity to take action on something, hasn't had the opportunity to smoke or not smoke in a meeting, right?
Yep.
And so when we think about that presumed intention, there does have to be this element of trust if we are the person taking that first step. And there has to be some acknowledgement that we can either assume positively or we can assume negatively when we create those things.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And that's where again, hopefully a big takeaway from all of this for people is what you and I are talking about is just having people take a step back and even question, what is my intention with this? Because so much of the conversations are happening at the policy or the practice level and debating characteristics of what that policy should be or the nuance of that. We were redoing some of our compensation within our company a year or two ago. And we had one of our comp rules basically fell out that people who were more client facing got paid more than people who were internal or operations facing. Okay. We were having discussions about should that continue, and more importantly, like if it continued, what was the right ratio between that? What did we and so we had to get down to, what did we believe to be true? What assumptions were we saying by this? Were we saying client facing people are more valuable than operations people? Were we saying they're twice, 3 to 10 times more valuable? What were we willing to claim? And then why did we believe that? Did we think they were harder to recruit? Did we think that it was more specialized? And just being able to have some of those conversations started to peel back some of those assumptions that we were making, and helped us to come up with more of the different experiments that we wanted to try. Because once we then understood what, at least as a shared group, we believed and where we had disconnects on what our beliefs were, then we were able to say, okay, what's something that either we need to go learn more about this? Maybe we assumed we pay them more because they're harder to recruit. Cool. That's an assumption maybe that we're making. Do we desire to go learn more about that to see if it's a valid assumption or if it's a limiting belief that we have? And we probably shouldn't do that. And so again, it's just about, I think, helping more people to wake up to the things that they're doing in their practices. Because I think when people create more of that space, I do think they're more, and this is again my bias and my belief here, I believe that people are more inclined to trust and to assume positive intent and to believe in the good of other people. And we need more people to be able to make space to be able to lean into that if we want to see more of that in the world, back to that virtuous cycle.
I agree. I agree 100%. I think that you have to give what you want to get. And I am not a person that believes that I need to see it. I'm not the type of person to say, oh, well, I'm not going to give respect until I get it, because then you're never going to get it. Like, you have to be, if you're going to be that one person, you should be it in your personal life, your professional life. You're going to give what you hope to get back. If you give trust, you hopefully get the trust back. And if anything, if you don't get the trust back, at least you're emulating what you'd like to get.
Yeah.
And I think this is a huge idea for me. I know it is for you, that I think is very, very much fundamental to the operating of a business that is really giving back or focused on the humanity. We can't say bring the human back to human resources, as my podcast title says, unless we really see that people will respond positively if you give something positive. They will respond negatively if you give something negative, right? It's just the way that the world works, I think.
I think you're right. And being able to lead with that,
Mm-hmm.
is something that other people will say sounds naive. And
Right.
Jean-Francois's memoir that I referenced earlier, in French, the English translation more or less of the book title is "The Company Liberated by the Lazy Little Naive Boss." And so like he understood that he was naive in what he was doing. The book I wrote is called Dare to Be Naive. It's there's something about being naive and almost kind of reclaiming some of that word.
I love that.
Because, at least to let you in on a secret here, that's not so secret because it's in the book, so sorry, Traci, is that the word naive actually means innate or genuine or authentic. The original root word of naive was used in a more positive sense. And it wasn't until cynicism and hyper-rational thinking really took over our workplaces that being naive was even really a bad thing. And so if I were to dare any of the people listening to be authentic, or dare them to be genuine, or dare them to listen to their inner voice, I think they're all receiving that. Well, that's also being naive. And some of that is then trusting. And to your point, being able to lead with that which you want brought back to you.
Right. I love that. This is something I'm going to take with me probably for a very long time. And in our team meetings at work, one of the things that we always talk about is like, or the question that we answer every week is, what did we learn recently? So I will share that I learned that because I think I always understood naive to be probably what the majority of people believe naive means, right?
Yeah.
Um, and when I think about just kind of this whole concept, it brings me back to one of the things that initially drew me to wanting to have you on the podcast, which was this idea of, or this question really, what would the world be like if we all acted from beliefs such as most people are trying their best, most people are worthy of trust, all people are inherently good? And this idea of what the world would be like, I think it does underpin this idea that naive or naivete is different than what we actually understand it to be. And this really does position this term beliefs. Like if our beliefs and understanding of words that we think we know or people who we believe are going to act as in such ways, if we change or challenge those beliefs, what changes then about our business, about our teams, right? Everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, and and we have to think. This is back to why does naive feel like a bad thing nowadays? You know, when we talk about our kids, you mentioned yours before, naively wanting to eat sand, right? There's this curiosity that comes from them
Right.
that it goes away over time. I have 4 kids myself, and it goes away because we start saying, no, 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 you don't know what the world is really like. You don't know
Right.
how things truly are and how humans truly are. Well, what informs most of what we think about how the world works and how things are done? A lot of it is how workplaces function, how corporations suggest. And when you and I know that those have been built on a lot of command and control things over the years that were meant to enrich some and not a large group of other people. The other is from the media and just
Mm.
the out of balance nature that we have of sharing cynicism versus extremely positive, wonderful things. There have been a number. There was a great TED talk that's now going around. A gentleman from Vancouver who I love it. It's all about all the good news from 2023 you didn't hear because of all of the diseases that were
Oh, that's
eradicated
amazing.
this last year. All of poverty is at a low. I'm not even going to get it right, but maybe we can find it for the show
Mm.
notes. But we don't want to be seen as naive because other people with louder microphones are saying, no, no, you don't know how things work around here. And yet my invitation to everybody here is that true? Like, is that true? Is it true that you can't trust Alfred to go get his own gloves? Because time and time again, we're actually proving that it does work. You can trust a lot of
Right.
people. And if you want to be able to trust others, you actually have to start to lead first and continue to make that happen.
Mm.
But it's going to take us each doing a little bit of work to say, I call it a chosen naivete. It's going from childlike wonder to this rational, hyper rational, oftentimes hyper masculine like approach of like this is how work should be done, to this third space that brings in back more of the intuitive and the rational. Right? It's just bringing some of these things back into balance and saying, does this feel intuitively true and rationally true? Like
Mm.
does this make sense? It isn't completely throwing thinking out, but understanding that we have
Right.
other brains that we can access.
That's fascinating. And when we think of the term don't be naive, it does, send an
Mm-hmm.
unspoken message there, right? That
Yeah.
like being naive is a negative thing when actually we've already understood now from what you've shared that being naive is not inherently a bad thing. It just means that you are acting with your intuition, potentially. You're acting genuinely, you're acting, in a way that, to your point, the world might see as a maybe an immature response to is going on. But actually, if we understand what you've just shared, that the way that we view the world is not necessarily based on our own created beliefs, but rather what is projected to us through someone else's beliefs, whether it is from the media or other lived experiences,
Well said.
it does allow us to break down what we want to believe and how we choose to believe. And so from that, I think this other topic, or I should say extension of this topic, is the idea of moving from beliefs to practices, which you shared with me, that disconnecting beliefs from practices is an important step, that there are companies who ultimately manifest their shared beliefs and align differently. And this does kind of still underpin a lot of what we've already talked about. But when you think practically, or how you, at least with your clients or people you've worked with in the past, how do you help companies and practitioners to understand how to move from beliefs to practices and why that's important?
Yeah, I think the how to move from beliefs to practices, again, it starts with they need to they need to start at practices and then get to beliefs. It's maybe it's I think it's still a relevant example, but the hybrid work example, in terms of all the debates around in office, out of office, where they're at, challenging teams to say, what are the beliefs that power that side versus that side? Is it I trust that people are working? Is it that I don't? Is it that honestly at the end of the day we don't have a good performance management system and therefore I have to see people to have this feeling that they're actually working? Is it what is it that's under there? And getting teams, and
Right.
sometimes you need an outside facilitator to help them see some of these tensions that are baked into this, getting them to be clearer on their beliefs, to then say, okay, we actually, the preponderance of us believe that people could work unsupervised, and we just need to do a better job of setting better goals or objectives and key results, or having better management conversations with people. Right? Like, great, maybe that's what's needed. What practices might we put into place to then do that? And this is where some of our work from the innovation side of things work out. You don't have to go rewrite the entire employee handbook or all of your standard operating procedures. What is the next experiment you could try to be able to test and learn more about some of those beliefs? And
Mm.
so I think this combining between what do we believe and then how might we practice it in a way that gets us more information or brings people into the loop of the thing that we're trying help out, right? We
Right.
started to experiment with, since comp is kind of a touchy subject, I like to use it as a practical example. We started to
Right.
experiment with pay transparency at our company. We didn't fully, like day two, we didn't put everybody's salaries online. We first started with financial ratios and pay ratios, and what did we want to project out there as our top earner to bottom earner ratio and our top to our average, and what did we believe? How did those things interact with that? Then what ratios did we want to use? And then we started out with publishing those things, and then saw what reactions and conversations we had. And so by being able to focus on what are we trying to practice, what do we actually believe to be true under that? Are those things true? What did we gain and what did we lose? Where did we learn those things? Do we want to shift any of those? And then is there a new experiment we could use with an evolved belief? We're able to start to make some progress in a really, hopefully, values and intentional way.
That's really, really interesting. I think, all of this really goes to show that the peopleship roles really, really matters, because if you have someone who, similarly to the way that you kind of operate within your business, assumes positive intent, or at least, at minimum is putting out the first effort of trust, or looking to, act with the practice of understanding and assuming positive intent rather than acting from beliefs, that then there is this more hopefully holistic feeling within the culture, that there is trust, that there is understanding, that there's openness, because all of that does ultimately, kind of feed into this feeling that cultures, are pervasive with, whether it's like being open, being trusting, or the opposite. And I think your example of hybrid versus remote is really, really, really perfect, because there are people and there are companies don't trust, and therefore need this feeling of control, and not even just a feeling, but need the action of control. And so if we see these as, almost, if we juxtapose the two, that, it's not necessarily to say that hybrid workforces or in-office workforces are untrusting, but when in an era where there can be effective and productive work done remotely, it does ultimately kind of counterbalance what is seen as a lack of trust.
Yeah.
So it's, or I should say, not a counterbalance, but really send the message that there's a lack of trust. So it's really, I do think there's a huge amount of pressure, and maybe not so much pressure, but responsibility placed on leaders if they want to be leaders that display humanism or humanity, and they want, ultimately, if they really want to trust employees, they just have to lead that way. Because I'm of the belief that here we come back to beliefs again, that people want to, they want to trust people, they want to do well, they believe people are good. I really do feel that way. So it's probably just harder for people to act as though they feel that way, because there is a sense of, right, there's just this sense of like, what happens if I do trust all of my employees unequivocally?
Yeah. Well, and this is where to pull back in the rational side of things, it's to understand that it isn't perfect and it isn't binary. One, it's not a spectrum. It is a spectrum of naivete and pragmatism, right? Like, we're not saying go be willfully ignorant. I'm not saying that. I don't leave my wallet out on the front porch, and I'm not going to give anybody my address right now to go test that. But I understand what someone told me one time is the asymmetrical power of trust. And that is exactly what Jean-Francois was talking about. 99, maybe 0.9% of the time, nobody's going to steal the gloves. 0.1% of the time, count on it that they will. Great. When we think about a no vacation policy or an unlimited vacation policy or something like that, being able to put something like that in place, everybody designs around the exceptions. And yet there's an asymmetrical upside to trust versus the downside of trust in a lot of these. And that is that the vast majority of the time, 95, 98, 98, most of people will act in the way that we're assuming they will act because decency and societal contracts and all of those other things that are there. And hopefully you've selected great people at the start, right? Like, all of these things are hopefully in place that you can trust this, and that it will get taken. I know I will get taken advantage of 1 or 2% of the time. And so, but I'm okay with that because of the huge upside that comes from the more trust that I bring, right?
Right. Like, let's focus on the 98, 99% of people, because they're the population we should be so worried about.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
And I think sometimes, and this is for larger organizations, when human resources sometimes is maybe not in there directly with the managers who are needing to take care of those exceptions. And so we end up what I call outsourcing management functions to systems and policies. We end up creating the policy in place of the management conversation that should have happened. We create the new system in place of the management conversation that should have happened. And so we then build up all of these structures. And I love what the Reddy and Aaron Dignan have talked about. Like, just like you have technical debt, you have organizational debt. Yeah. Right? And you keep building up that org debt from all of these things that a shared services group created to be able to help manage things that maybe individual managers could have been better equipped to deal with.
Right. And the root cause of that is maybe how we lead change management, learning and development, and all of those things that do enable leaders and managers to have better conversations. It's almost like I'm having a flashback, like, oh man, how many things have I had to create because we didn't just problem solve the root cause, which is that leader does not have the tools in their tool belt yet to handle that conversation or that situation, which didn't even become relevant or isn't even relevant to other people. So I think that's a really, really, really cool way to help people understand org debt, and also help people think about to think about their own experiences within their practice, especially for those listening, mostly in HR. We have to really challenge the status quo here. If we're responding with institutionalized processes, maybe we need to just pause and really think, well, what's actually going to help resolve whatever it is that we're looking to resolve, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is also borrowed from Aaron's group, but how do you approach it with minimally sufficient documentation, right? What is
Right.
what is sufficient yet minimal, right? Like how
Right.
do you
Right.
approach each of these things so that it isn't so heavy-handed?
Right.
And it becomes harder when you have individuals whose sole jobs are to do those things. And so I always, it's a watch out for growing organizations that they don't just assume, oh, well, the answer to this is obviously more policy, more procedure, more system because we're bigger and that's what bigger companies do. Just again, it goes back to, I think this theme through all of this is being intentional and being conscious of any of those things as you go and not just copy paste what someone else did before you.
Right. Well, Joshua, I really appreciate you teaching us so much. I feel like I've learned a million new things in this 40-minute conversation, and I really appreciate it. And I know I'm not the only one that's going to feel that way. So thank you for your thought leadership on this and the intention that you are practicing every time you're talking to someone about these ideas, because it does, even for someone like me and many, I'm sure most of the listeners who really act this way, like to move from beliefs to practices and really assume positively, just generally speaking, there is still something to take away. And there are those maybe innate things that we do that we don't realize we're doing that contribute to the opposite effect that we're looking to have based on this conversation. So again, thank you for joining the podcast and thank you for sharing all of your wisdom on this topic.
You're welcome, Traci. This has been a lot of fun. And, the closing thing that I would say, I appreciate you calling me a thought leader. My PR firm joked that I'm a very reluctant thought leader because what I think is more people just need to continue to lead their own thoughts. So even if everything that people just heard us say here, like even assume positive, I should assume positive intent, even take that and go through the 4 questions I put in my book, which is, where did you learn that? Is it true? And what do you gain and what do you lose by holding that belief? Like anything that we did, just own thinking through anything that we put out there. Don't just take what Traci and I are saying and copy and paste that as well. All right.
Right. I love that. That's a perfect way to end this. And actually, I'm going to ask you one more question. Where can listeners connect with you, read your book, buy it, all of the above?
Yep. So I'm most active on LinkedIn. You can find me at, I think my handle is something like Josh Berry, GPHR, former GPHR certified. So you can find most of my new content there. And then the website is daretobinaive.com, or you can learn more about our company at econic.co. That's econic.co.
Amazing. And we'll have all those linked in the show notes. Joshua, thank you so much again for joining and for being on the podcast this week.
Thanks, Traci. Have a great week.
You too. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.